All right. So this next segment here is called Which File? I actually have two names for this segment. One is called Which File, and the other is Can you use the H file without queens? So we've got basically two questions which come down to the same thing. In this position here, there are two open files, right? Now, with queens on the board, it might be quite normal to go for an attack on the H file. And when we were commenting this game yesterday, Alex Yermolinsky and I, the very first thing he said when he saw this position was like, play the queen to H2 and go for checkmate. Now, of course, he knew there were no queens on the board. But it makes the exact point that if this were a middle game, you would definitely think here that the H file was a very promising file to go to look towards attacking the black king. I mean, you would also notice the black king doesn't have a knight defending on f6, which is a typical defender for the king side. So there's really like this bishop, and then white has chances to try and checkmate on h7 and h8 if they can get by that bishop, or if they can get past that bishop. Flip to the other hand. On the other hand, often in the middle game or end game, a central file might be of great value as well. And seeing as there are queens traded, you might think that here the D file is more useful because you're not going to be able to land a checkmate, so fight for the main open file in the center of the board. Okay, so that's kind of the question here. Now, this position, just real quick, is taken from the game between Grandmasters Wesley So and Cristian Chirila. So Wesley was playing white in this game, and despite the trade of queens, Wesley in this position played rook h4 and went for an h-file strategy. So I want to analyze a couple possibilities from this position, and basically I'm trying to look at what we can do with the h-file and whether or not it's more valuable than the d file, which is the better position for your rooks if you were in this position, and what you should sort of like aim for as a strategy here. Okay, so first I'm going to try an idea of mine that was not played. Okay, now my idea starts with f3 instead of rook h4. Now let's assume that Cristian puts his bishop on d7 like he did against Wesley. My next move is to go bishop to c4. So now I start to target the e6 pawn. Okay. Now, my plan here for white is going to be to play rook h7 instead of h4, and then put the other rook on h1. So it's going to be we're going to start off with an h-file plan, just like Wesley did. But we're going to see if we can save a tempo on f3 instead of rook h4 and put our rook all the way on h7 and find out if that is a good or a terrible idea. Okay, so of note that right away this means that there's no like f6 kind of moves to dislodge white's pieces. Also note that in general the move b5 is not going to be very good disrupting this bishop because of bishop f7 check, rook f7, knight f7, and then if king f7, bishop takes the knight on c5 that's left hanging. So, and there's a number of other possible tactics like this, just winning a pawn, right? So we're going to essentially, or on bishop f7, rook f7, there's also bishop c5, which also wins a pawn. So we're essentially going to discount this b5 move. There, you guys know why I'm not looking at it. So now let's continue. So first, I'm going to play a simple move from black, just bringing his rook to the open file, right? So like a kind of counter argument to the H file would be like, okay, the use of the D file. So we're just going to try this first before we try any particular defenses. And then we're going to see whether or not my idea produces any actual danger for black. So rook here. And now I'm going to play one more simple move for black, just opening his rook on this file. Possibly, once it comes here, he could have an idea of playing bishop a6 to try and challenge this bishop, trade the bishop, and, you know, get like a target square here on d3, and also alleviate the pressure on f7. So bishop c8. So now I'll bring the other rook to h1. Now, can you guys see what my idea is now that, well, you know, my idea was putting the pieces like this, but because there's like a threat once they get here. What's my intended threat for white in this position? All right, Farhan is right. My dream idea here was that eventually, by playing rook h7 instead of rook h4 and putting this pressure on f7, I could use a rook sack to break through on this f7 square. Okay, so I want to go rook here. Oh, sorry, I have to make a move for black. I'm going to make a really pointless move just to illustrate my threat for everybody, okay? So here, rook check. Now, the king can go to g8 or to f6. If the king comes to g8, then after I play bishop takes f7 check, not that it's my only move, but if I play bishop takes f7 check, this is one option. It wins a pawn for white, right? I got black to sack the exchange back and won a pawn on f7. And, you know, then my rook is threatening e7, and my position might be generally good here as well. The other thing I could do once I get to this position is play bishop d4, threatening rook h8 checkmate. And this is going to force black to sack the exchange on d4, right? Yes, Actor points out that I just told you guys not to go for winning a pawn. In the opening, if you have undeveloped pieces, you should, is kind of like the demarcation line, right? Like if you don't have any developed pieces and your opponent's developing their pieces and you're just trying to capture a pawn, then that's the thing that I find suspicious. I think like developing your pieces is number one. But if all your pieces are really good, eventually the point of having good pieces is to collect your opponent's pawns or to checkmate them. But against a good opponent, it's very, very difficult to checkmate, so you usually end up just trying to get one pawn out of your checkmating threats, right? And then, you know, this defense would come in. The material's equal again, and yeah, white doesn't seem to have any huge overwhelming advantage there, so better is bishop f7 winning a pawn. Make sense? And now we try to convert this position here. Okay. So let's look at this position after I've played rook h1. I've finally got my threat set up. What defense do we have available for black? Oh, I forgot to mention an important variation, which is that here the black king can come out. And here also white needs to prove their compensation because they're down in exchange. You can take on f7, but black won't be forced to sack an exchange. So, and you can play bishop d4 check, but now the king defends e5. So in this position, my intention had been to play f4. That was my general intention. And I'm hoping to box this king in by controlling e5 and eventually win this position somehow. But maybe actually the move knight f7 would be really, really good too. Maybe I kind of missed the boat on this one because knight f7 threatens knight takes rook, and it also threatens bishop g5 checkmate. I hadn't noticed that when I first came up with my idea. Oh, but MC did notice it. Good on him. Yeah. So this is actually a winning move against king f6. Okay? So here we are. White's threatening rook to g7 check. And you know, black's defenses or responses should involve not letting rook takes g7 win. Yeah, e5 is actually also playable there, Johnny. VF24. e5 is also pretty good for white, but knight f7 is the best move there. Yeah. Yeah, you guys are right. e5 is fine. But knight f7 is the best now that we've looked at that. It just straight up wins. I mean, one of the best things about e5 is that after king e5, you could play knight f7 and win back the rook, right? And win a pawn on f7 and open up the 7th rank for your rook. So you might as well... Sorry, I'll put the position for you while we talk about it. One of the best things about e5, since 2 people asked, we're going to look at it. One of the best things about e5 is that you could then follow up like this, right? And then you've opened up your rook and won back your exchange and won back this pawn. But you can do all of this for free by just playing knight f7 first, right? You're threatening bishop g5, which is mate in 1. You're threatening e5, which is mate in 2. And you're threatening to take their rook. And if they take yours, then, you come here, and let's say this move, for example. And super happy, right? You've achieved everything for white. All right. So, defenses for black. We have the option of playing e6 or e5 for black. Right? E6 blocks the bishop on c4 from attacking f7. That seems like the most obvious one. There's also the possibility of e5, which basically has the idea that maybe your king could come out to f6, and white wouldn't have this e5 kind of move. But does this solve the problem of bishop to g5? I don't think it does. So I think we can reject e5 as a defense for black. And let's start off by looking at e6. This means that if white sacks now, after king g8 or king f6, white won't be able to take on f7 because it's not attacked enough times. So king g8 on bishop d4. We threaten checkmate, and it looks like black could sack the exchange or play f6. If they sack the exchange and then save the knight. Ooh, they have to be careful because this tactic might actually win a couple pawns for white here. No, there's knight e5. But honestly, knight e5 probably still loses to bishop takes c8. And then white's threatening to come back or take the knight. I'm not going to analyze this exhaustively. I think this is going to lose for black, so I'm just going to put the knight on a different square instead of d7 and not allow that. Okay, so I'm just going to go here to make my point. So if you look at this position, white has not won any material, and it looks like the attack against the black king in f7 is done. It's covered. Okay? But white does have a nice position. And specifically, they might actually play like e5 now to keep this knight from coming back to the game through d6, retreat their rook, and bring this knight to try and bring this knight to e4 maybe. And this could still be like a nice positional advantage for white, but it's not like amazing. And if black came out at this point, the best move for white might be e5 now. e5. This seems actually pretty good. Well, I didn't really look at g4 yet, but the two branches I considered are king here, knight f7. Going for this. And I don't think black can allow some knight discovered check here, like knight d6. If you save the rook, I'm guessing that something like this will be bad for black. Okay, so the main branch I had thought was here, and then the point is check, king somewhere. Trade these rooks basically to undefend the rook on d8, then take it. And white has a winning endgame here, right? With an extra pawn in the bishop pair. So if the king comes to e5, then again we play knight f7 with just like a fork, just getting back the material we've sacked. You get this position here, and the material's still equal, but white is still threatening bishop f4 checkmate, as well as like rook takes c7 and just being generally in a much better position than black with an active bishop pair. So this position would be good for white as well. So it looks like after e6, you could take on g7, but if black just goes king g8 and then sacks back on d4, it's a very minimal progress for white. It's a good position, but it's not a win. Other options after e6. Could we play bishop to d4 instead of sacking? So first, let's see if black can accept our sacrifice. So technically speaking, he could accept the sacrifice. He didn't lose 10 pieces or get checkmated or something, but the resulting position is lost for black anyway. I mean, it's close, but it's lost. So that's not a good sign for black. It means this bishop d4 move might be pretty strong. If black's forced to play e5 here, then he'll certainly lose to rook g7. This is pretty simple and clear. Can you guys calculate this? That rook g7 wins after e5? Or another question is, when I show you the move e5, do you have this instinct that the answer should be to just take the bishop so that your bishop can get through? And the calculation is really not very many steps. It's bishop takes check, and if the king comes back, rook h8 checkmate. I'm sure the vast majority of you guys see. The key point to see is that if black plays f6, it opens this diagonal, so rook h7 is also actually just checkmate in 1. It's only a mate in 1, but you have to just notice that, if they ever move the f pawn, that becomes checkmate. So no e5 here, no bishop takes d4 here. So that means this reduces black to an exchange sack himself. You could, again, counter-sack the exchange and have a positional advantage instead of a small material advantage, or you could go like this. And this position, it's a material advantage for white, but I think your whole attack and all your positional advantages are gone. This actually feels hard to win to me. But it might just be the amount of work involved. It might be that a good player wouldn't care and would eventually just win this like they're supposed to. I think what you want to do is play f4 and e5 for white here, first of all, so you restrict what black's doing, and then switch your... And then either try for knight e4 to f6 or switch your rooks to the d file. Yeah, actually, I may be being a little conservative about how this would be difficult. Maybe just because it's a little bit of a headache for me because I'm personally not great at playing these positions. But actually, yeah, once you go after the dark squares again here, I think it still shows a significant advantage for white. Not to mention, an interesting move to keep our eyes on is this b4 move. We'll look at it again in a moment, but in another context. But if they ever play knight d7, knight e6 is usually winning, right? Because you trap the king, so they have to just give a whole rook and everything else. So b4, can send the knight probably to b7 to be able to try and come back into the game. It's an interesting move to keep our eyes on as an option. Yeah. That also helps us win this endgame, right? With f4 and then like e5 next. If knight d6, you play e5 anyway, and you have checkmate with the 2 rooks. So you play f4. The bishop comes back to g7, I think, and you play e5. And now, right, you've hurt this knight. And this knight being badly placed probably gives you enough time to go for knight e4, f6. This seems not that hard to win, actually, once you put in some effort to figure out how to do it. Okay, so this e6 move might allow bishop d4 as a very good answer. And yeah, so then the other question would be, you know, does b4 first make this even better? Let's see. I'm guessing that would actually lead to knight to b7. And now our best move is probably just the same bishop d4, but let's just check. Yeah, I think it's just bishop d4 transposing. I don't see anything else super much better. But bishop d4 is really good. So it's like clear progress against this e6 defense. So what other defenses did we had? We had bishop f6 suggested for black, right? Bishop f6, but in this position that just opens up the attack on f7. Unless you meant bishop f6 as a defense to bishop d4? No, because that would have been after e6, bishop d4. Yeah, so you couldn't play it there. So here, basically, the answer would be just bishop f7 check, rook f7, knight f7. You win in exchange, and then you follow up with e5 after this rook moves. I'm not even sure where the rook goes, actually. B4 knight d7 allows knight takes e6. That was the point I was making the other line. If I can find it in all these variations, e6, bishop d4. Right, and then I tried b4 as well somewhere. So I'll just repeat it once and somebody asked. But this is the danger with knight to d7, is that white gets this extra knight takes e6 option. Yeah, I mean, here it might be slightly complicated, but it'll probably still lose if white's precise, right? So I'm threatening rook takes g7 check, and I'm threatening rook h8, bishop h8, rook h8 checkmate. Have you guys seen that one? It's a good one to know, right? Like here. And if the knight comes to f6, actually this is like a tricky line. So your bishop's counterattacked, and if you play bishop f7, king f7, then the king can take back here. So it's looking not that easy to win. So actually you can only win using the tactic I just showed you guys. You play bishop takes f6 first. Only defense for black is to take here, right? Because if this move, you get this, right? And that's what I was talking about, of breaking through on this diagonal. So the only defense is here, and then check here and checkmate. That's pretty. Yeah, Ryan, this is one single question I'm trying to answer derived from a Pro Chess League game by Wesley So yesterday. Okay. So, at this point, I'm actually not finding any real defense for black once white gets in all the moves that I wanted to play. Okay? So, at minimum, we can see that if white gets the time to develop all the pieces to the squares he wants to, you can use the H file to produce like tangible, even unparryable threats in this queenless position. But, you know, if I asked you guys, what do you think? Is this position feeling like a queenless middle game or an endgame to you? What would you guys be tending towards? Do you we've been looking at some variations at this point. Does this feel like a middle game or an end game to you? And for those who don't know, quick refresher, the difference between the end game and the middle game is that in the end game, king safety is not an important factor and passed pawns are an important factor. Whereas in the middle game, king safety is an important factor and passed pawns are much less threatening. So yeah, so far this has felt a lot like a middle game. White has enough firepower that there's a lot of tactics and dynamic play and threats and so on. So this is a queenless middle game. So the question is, can you attack on the H file in a queenless middle game? To me, so far it seems like the answer is yes. Now let's try and come up with a better defense for black, okay? To try and find out whether the H file or the D file was really better. Yeah, that's one aspect of it, Ryan. When kings can walk up, it being the endgame. That's one aspect, right? That's the king safety aspect. There's basically two factors that tend to determine whether you're in a middle game or an end game. And one is king safety, and the other is the importance and value of passed pawns. So, there's one special kind of end game that's queen and rook versus queen and rook. Not to divert too long on a sidetrack. That's kind of like a separate discussion. But queen and rook versus queen and rook endgames are called endgames because passed pawns become so important in them, but they're actually an endgame where king safety still matters and you don't usually rush up with your king, right? So, there's not like one bright line and everything on one side is an endgame and everything on the other side is a middle game, but those are the two factors you use to categorize it as king safety and the importance of passed pawns. All right. Obviously, those are correlated with piece trades. Like the simplistic understanding that we first have of an endgame and a middle game is like a middle game is when there's lots of pieces and an endgame is when there's very few. But, when do you go from middle game to endgame? Sometimes it's just the queen trade. Other times it's other things. So here we are in the middle game. Let's see if we can find a better defense for black here instead of bishop to c8. So in this position, it's still viable to play bishop f6. No, white can take on well, can white take on f7? Let's see. This rook's not yet defended, so if you play like a line like bishop f7, rook f7, knight f7, rook f8, you can get these pieces kind of trapped, right? So we got to watch out for that. Okay, so bishop f6. This might be a possible move. Maybe white has a winning tactic with rook f7, though. And by winning, I mean, a pawn or so. Yeah, I see your defense. You want to look at bishop e6. We will in a second. So, yeah, if bishop takes here, then presumably this discovered check is good enough to hold black's attention for a moment, and then we recapture this bishop with 2 extra pawns for white and a winning position. And if rook takes, then knight takes, and if black goes for a tactic with b5 or something, there's knight takes d8, and if black saves the rook, then white can move the knight somewhere with check, and white's up a pawn. Clear pawn, and, still a very good game. So, no bishop f6, so let's look at another possible defense, early bishop e6. All right, now this seeks to exploit the fact that the rook is kind of not shoddily defended at the moment. If white takes here, black has a chance to grab this rook. Oh, you know what? White still comes out ahead, I think. If I'm being careful, I think I noticed that white can trade on d8 to grab this f7 pawn. And not only do you win a pawn, but you've got the bishop pair now, and you're threatening rook h1. So actually his king is still uncomfortable, even with the reduced material. I know you love pawns, and you're already in the endgame, and you're all developed, so you've got full permission to grab them now. Okay, so on bishop e6, knight e6, black would continue to defend with either knight takes e6 or pawn takes e6. Let's try knight takes e6. Now let's say I keep going for my h-file. And maybe now bishop or... Well, now I'm not sure that white has any threat. Black's successfully traded one minor piece, and that might be enough to take the sail out of white's wings on the h-file. Right? Because I'm not sure yet what white's threat is here. One of the key things is that this knight that was terrible on c5 is now like in the game. And this is how Chirila defended in the actual game, was by just plunking a piece on e6 and being willing to take on this bad pawn structure if fe6 at some point, and just saying like, yeah, I'll have a bad pawn structure. My position was bad. I will try to defend with this bad pawn structure. And he could have drawn this game against Wesley, I'm pretty sure. So this is definitely a viable defensive idea for black. I'm not seeing any sign of what white's planning to do to win this game now. Let me go back and move. See, my bishop's hanging, so I don't really have many options. I either take on e6 with some piece, or I totally retreat and let this black piece take over the better territory. If I want to keep my knight. I don't know what kind of threats I'll have, though, now on the h-file without that knight. So now maybe a5 for black. Black's looking at like harassing white on these two light squares here. Basically, like I want to be ready as black to play bishop takes a2 at some point when white plays rook h1. I have to have some kind of counter play probably. And if white's trying to play b3 or something, I'm going to play a4 and keep going after his queen side here for some counterplay. So yeah, the idea of keeping the white bishop with bishop e2 is to still go for an attack. Rook h1 and then a pawn storm with f5, just like Outsmiter said. That's definitely what I had in mind is what white could still try here. If we're going to still try to, you know, just do what we can with the h-file. And I admit that I'm immediately feeling more pessimistic. My instincts are kicking in as like much more pessimistic about white's chances of doing something on the h-file once I see this position with the black bishop having taken over this great diagonal and removed the pressure against f7, and with black having potential counterplay here on the queen side. So I'm not feeling super convinced that my position is great, but let's see if I just go all out on the h-file, sack that a-pawn. Let's just see if I got anything, okay? I could again try this move b4. That's been interesting in the past. That was the another reason to play a5, just make b4 much more costly for white. I could try this exchange sack again, let's see. And I could try bishop d4 again. Let's try bishop d4. Oh, I see what you want to do. You wanted to play this version where we trade the knight, and then when they retake on e6 and we go rook h1, even though I didn't see any threat here, you wanted to still try and play f5 from here, and here you've got the bishop pair. That's actually more promising. I'm going to switch to your idea actually because mine is definitely not going to work actually. Yeah, so this bishop e2, a5, rook h1. Folks, I don't think this is really going to work for white. There's just no threats on f7, so a lot of these tactics just simply aren't going to work anymore. Like here, the whole point of this bishop d4 move, I think, was that at the end, white would have bishop f7 check to win, right? Or wait, white still has a win, though, right? This thing, maybe? Let's see. Yeah, still playable, but actually not as winning, right? Because we can't get into the 7th rank. We can't start winning back the pawns. This looks like a very playable exchange stack for black, actually, right? Where your king's almost mated, your bishop does nothing, and all the black pieces are good, and your rooks can't get into anything. And black, yeah, this is not even good for white. So you see how dramatically things have changed, okay? And now we're going to go look at Outsmiter's idea, which is to trade once on e6. And we're going to go knight takes e6 for black, rook ah1, and we're going to see if we can pawn storm this position. So we have fixed black's knight for them. They do have their position more generally coordinated, but we're still going to see if we can pawn storm here. Use our bishop pair to maybe still go after black on the king side. All right, so let's just play this out a little bit and see what it might look like. If we played f4, f5, and black did nothing in between, would that create a significant threat? Hard to be sure. We might also need the g-pawn up there to have a real threat. I'm just trying to assess quickly, like I'm looking ahead in my head, making like 3 or 4 moves for white without black making any moves to see what like the shape of white's threat and attack eventually are, so then I can, you know, play like more plausible defensive moves for black leading up to it. So one of my thoughts here would be to go after this bishop, which is now the uncontested light squared bishop on this diagonal. I want to relieve the pressure on that diagonal. So one thought is to try and play like c6, b5, a5 to corral the bishop. But it looks like white can probably play a4 in a lot of cases, and that'll be enough to secure the light squares on the queen side and keep that bishop in business. So I might need more than that if I want to, right? If I want to try and upset his happiness, right? So this bishop's on a super useful square, so I'm trying to go after his security, right? Like kick him off of the good square. But it looks like the square is both useful and secure. That's bad news for black. I can't really do much against this piece right now. So if I can't do much against the piece, what else can I do? I could try to play bishop f6, knight g7, h5, but there's rook h8 mate whenever we play knight to g7. I could try to play bishop f6, knight g5, but it probably also loses. It doesn't lose quite as obviously. But I doubt it's really good. I mean, the knight's bad on g5. White can also retreat his rook once the knight comes to g5, and you've got nothing better to do than go back to e6. And now that black has reduced some of the pressure on f7 by getting rid of this knight, and left this rook less well defended and less secure than when there was a knight defending it, I'm starting to feel like, you know, it would be a fine improvement for white to just have this rook back on h3 instead of h7 or h2 or wherever. So what is black to do here to reduce white's pressure, or to get a counterplay somewhere? Right, bishop f6 might also just run into f4, stopping the whole knight g5 idea and introducing e5, since white wants to pawn storm anyway. That's what you were going to play anyway, was f4. So it incidentally would also stop an idea that wouldn't have helped black anyway. So, having trouble coming up with black's next play here. Does anybody see a defense for black here? This actually feels really unpleasant now that I'm really looking at this position. I'm feeling pretty unhappy for black. Like, my knight would ideally be on a dark square, not a light square. because what I need to do as black here is cover my light squares. So I want my knight to be on a dark square where it's safe from my opponent's bishop. In general, my dark squares are stronger. I want to be on a dark square defending light squares. I got to get this guy off of me. That frees up so I don't have to defend this guy. Okay, so this knight wants to go to d6. So should I try knight c5, b7, d6? What? I mean, I haven't thought of anything better, so let's give it a shot. From d6, it'll also tag the e pawn if this f pawn is advanced. Now, white could trade just to like isolate the opposite colored bishops and attack with it. But I'm going to be more ambitious than that and try and do even better. Let's see. Can we go bishop d4 here? Takes pawn takes, rook takes. No. Okay. So I'm going to try something interesting. I'm going to try and throw this g pawn up to g5. And then on knight d6, I'm going to go here. And the point of rushing this g pawn up here is seen in the variation bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes. Now we've got checkmate here. Okay, so moving the pawn to g5 is basically a prep for the move bishop d4. And there's no other defense here for black to the threats of rook g7 and rook h8. The move e5, you guys should remember how to beat it, right? Everybody still on board with that? As you get to know a position, the relevant variations will start coming to you faster and faster, right? Okay, so we bring the pawn to g5. That stops knight d6 for the moment. And in fact, it introduces our first real threat, which is bishop d4. I know you wanted to pawn storm with f5, but I'm sure you're happy with the g pawn as well. This is kind of like a slightly slick tactical threat, which we can probably still follow up with f4, f5 kind of stuff. What should black do? Make some space for their king somewhere? It's not in time though now, right? If I go like f6 with the idea of like takes here and getting the king out this way. Sorry, this way. It's not in time right now. So maybe I'd have to do that before my knight twirl. So I play knight c5, g4 from white. Okay, so now I'm going to play e6, blocking this bishop. And then if g5, I'll play rook here. Now if bishop d4, I can take... Oh, but because the pawn attacks the knight, there's no time for king f8, right? So here black's mated or loses the knight. This position is looking super difficult for black. It doesn't seem like black can move very much. I mean, we're not even starting to dream of counterplay, but it looks like white can really drum up some serious threats, even with a pair of pieces traded off. So I'm going to put this position here as another data point for can white use the H file without queens? And this is another answer in the direction of yes. So now we're going to try another defense for black, which is in this position here. Instead of playing bishop e6, we're going to try knight e6. And Visigoth has a question that we're going to answer real quick before that. So he's saying, what if in these positions here, we just play c5 to stop bishop d4? The thing is, bishop d4 is not white's only idea. It's just what seems to work against this knight c5 move. If you just sit here, you don't even need to play c5 to stop bishop d4, because the knight's stopping it. But you need to do something, because white's going to play g4, f4, and then f5. And eventually that's going to break black's king side, right? And there's going to be just, it's awkward on this light square diagonal. So Yes, you can prevent white from playing bishop d4 by playing c5 or even without playing c5. But white's main threat isn't bishop d4. White's main threat is to go g4, f4, etc. And the problem for black is that there's like just no moves to make here. It's not necessarily that knight c5 was bad or that he wants to play c5, but none of his moves really change the situation, which is his pieces have no targets and his king is coming under attack eventually. So we're going to go back here, and instead of bishop e6, we're going to now try the defense of knight to e6. Okay. So now black's going to keep his light squared bishop and trade his knight instead. Now here, if white trades on e6, it goes very badly for him. But because the bishop's not threatening our bishop on c4, because it's a knight instead of a bishop here, we can just play rook h1. Yeah, Visigoth against knight c7, white will play a4. And you're not going to get in knight c7, a6, b5 in time. Nor is it even going to be possible, really. If white retreats the bishop from c4 to b3 or a2, then if you play b5, white can play bishop takes c5. There's just... It's too passive and slow, and you just don't have the piece coordination for black to make any of this really work out. So rook h1. So now we're going to trade off a piece of white's and see about this position. Maybe now I can counter with bishop here. Well, I have to watch out for bishop takes e7, actually, right? That wins. So let me defend that first. Bishop f6 gets mated. You guys see the mate? Pop quiz. How does bishop f6 not work? / how does it epic fail? All right, I'm going to assume those who are going to answer have answered by now. And not wait on the lag and just show you guys. Hopefully you were right about that one. So that leaves rook to e8. I don't really like either rook to e8. I guess I like this rook to e8 better than the other rook to e8. Okay. Now my idea for black would be next move maybe to play bishop e6. How's white feeling about his h-file? Is his h-file doing anything good for him here? Oh, that's very fancy, MC. I do usually feel fancy, so I might do that. All right, here we could try something kind of weird. I could go here, here, bishop h6, going after this, trying to use my rook on the h-file. I think the only good defense here is probably rook to g8. Then I play rook f4 for white. And then g5 should get black out of trouble, right? I mean, to be honest, this is still like a messy position. Where white gets 3 pawns against a bishop. It's not like bad for white, but so even this sacrifice didn't lose for white, but I think it's a draw. I don't think it wins for white. So, whoops. All right, we need rook e8. Okay, so bishop f7 here doesn't win, but it draws, which is already not a great sign for black. Let's see what else white can do. He could play e5 here. And black can't take it because of f7. So you could play e5. But black's plan is to come here. Challenge the bishop. Plus we gave black bishop f5 check, which might be their new plan. I don't really see how to make a threat for white here anymore. Do you guys? Let's try bishop here, going to d4. I could play e5 or c5, or I could allow it. Let's see if this thing is even any good, right? Now black can play e5 if they want to. Can they also just accept this? What does white have here? White has a win of a rook. So bishop e6, not so good. e5, stopping bishop d4. Okay, I come back here, chase this rook off the d file. And I think it's time to give up on the h file. I don't think we can do anything more here. I think it's time to switch to the d file. I think we've done everything we could on the h file. And the best that white can do now is probably like retreat and then just move this rook to d1. You know, and switch to this thing here. La da 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 da. And you want to go bishop f6. I don't know if you want to go bishop f6 for white or black or in which position, but this position here, people, nominally looks better for white, but I think black holds it, right? Because they just have rook to e7 on rook d7, king e6 covering the entry point. This looks like it'll be a draw. Okay, I think I know which position you mean now. So we're talking this position here probably. You wanted to try this. Here. Okay, and now you can take on f7 with your bishop or your rook. So this is a little bit complicated. Let's see if we can sort it out correctly. So first of all, like the very direct bishop f7, king here, bishop takes. You're attacking this bishop, but it saves itself like this while covering g6. And now this pair of bishops is going to cover everything in a moment. So this line here is not going to work out. You can also try grabbing this pawn. And then this stops rook f7 and rook d7. Does white have a tactic here? They really very much need one. It would have to be rook takes rook and bringing the next rook into the 7th rank, right? Be the only way to try and get some power before black fixes things. But again, it seems like it's just barely not enough, right? Rook takes, king takes, check. There's king to d8. And we can't seem to deal with black. Rook f7, the bishop can come here, and then rook f8 covers things. So this doesn't work, right? We could take with the rook first, and then the defense is bishop e6. And very hard to make this work again. Looks like you'd have to try this and this. But white's just not going to get enough here, right? You're struggling to try and draw. So it doesn't work. So I think that in this position here, like I was saying, it's time for white to switch back to the D file. And the H file has actually petered out. Okay? So now we finally have one answer of white wasn't able to achieve much with the H file. Certainly not to break through on the H file. Black's traded a couple pieces. And then, I mean, we did at least get like a little bit of a concession out of black, right? We managed to play bishop e3, threatening bishop d4, and it was actually annoying enough that we got this. That gave us the D file. But by this point, there was so little left on the board that I was thinking that black just draws, even though we get to the D file. So this is the first successful defense we found to my H file plan, but I think it is pretty successful. So we see there was some serious threats, some tricks for black to navigate, but we have successfully defended this, right? And the key was, again, just coming to e6, particularly going with the bad knight first before using the bishop. Trading this piece off and then defending from there. That seemed to be the answer for black. Okay, so now the second half of our question is, what can white do with the D file? So let's play rook h4 like Wesley did. Bishop c4. So he kicked the bishop off of covering d1. Then he develops this piece of the best square, putting pressure on e6. And here his opponent played knight to e6. Same plan that we finally came up with for black against rook a to h1, right? Trade a piece on e6. Now, in this position, Wesley just traded off on e6, getting the structural advantage, and then went to the H file anyway from here. And you see he tried to go after black's structure with his rooks like this. So he's using the H file to lift the rooks and attack this G pawn head on. Okay, it was interesting. I mean, he had a little pull, but what we're going to examine here is if in this position he could have switched from the H file play to the D file, and whether or not this would have been a good move here. Rook to D1. Okay, so let's quickly get a brief tactical bearing on this. White's threatening rook takes D7. If the bishop moves to the wrong place, white can just take on e6 and win. Okay, that's like the simple story. If black just defends the bishop, in fact, white can take on d7 and then take on e6. And as I said, just win. This is game over because you end up a whole piece ahead if you take this one. And you've got a crushing 2 pieces against a rook if black doesn't take back here. So black can neither play rook to d8 nor bishop c6. The move knight takes g5 also allows white to just make very, very clinical use of the D file by getting into the 7th row. Knight's still attacked, so black pretty much has to come back to e6. I mean, you know, maybe knight h7 is another move or whatever, but don't worry, this line's not going to last super long. And then, so it's not going to matter too much. And then my point is that white just grabs a free pawn, right? So now he's enlarged the 7th row, and he's up a pawn, and he's got pressure on e6 and f7, and he's got a bishop pair. So some way or other, white can eventually win this position. So knight takes g5 is also out tactically as a solution. So that pretty much seems to me to only leave one move for black, bishop c8. Tactically speaking, that's the only thing I see. If anyone else sees a different defense for black that was available here, let me know soon, but I'm operating on the assumption that this was actually an only move, bishop c8 in response. All right, so now we've got control over the D file. what is the next step? Well, there's a few options. Bishop d5 doesn't trap the rook because of rook b8. I'm tempted by the idea of bishop b5 to d7. Just trying to trade that piece and get the rook to d7, right? You could now switch the rook over to h1 and go for the h-file now that you've discoordinated black's rook and bishop a little bit. But I'm not going to look at that idea right now because I'm going to look at what we can do with the d-file, okay? Otherwise, rook d1 would just be a tactic that improves the idea of playing on the h-file. So I'm going to really look if we've got any ways to stay on this d-file and make use of it, okay? So, ideas from here. Let's try taking on e6. Black must recapture with the pawn and not the bishop, because if they recapture with the bishop, you immediately show the value of the d-file by getting into the 7th rank. And, you know, there may be this like tactic trying to save a pawn, but things are not going to work out for black. I don't know if rook h6 or rook g4 is better, but we counterattack this pawn in my first simple variation and then come ahead a pawn like this. Okay? So basically the d-file is going to force black to take on d takes e6 while leaving this pair of bishops. Compared to in the game where black was able to take on e6 with his bishop first, trade both of those pieces before playing fe6. Now at the moment, basically I would say the bishop on c4 compares quite favorably with the bishop on c8. So that's why this might be a promising difference for white. The other difference is that this bishop keeps this rook from being as well placed as in the game. So you could definitely ask if now he could switch to the same plan he did in the game of like rook h1, rook g4, rook h3, and attacking the g-pawn. That could be very, very strong. I kind of want to look at f4, f5 first, though. Okay? So let's just play f4 and see what comes next. There could also be an interesting idea now of like rook h1 and bishop d4 at some point, which we may or may not get to talking to. But the point now would be that there's no e5 because of this. So you could trade off the bishop and maybe get your rooks in better. But again, I just want to try this like f4 move first for a little bit because I have a pretty good feeling about this move. Black basically needs to cover this e-pawn, like big time, right? They need to defend it. First of all, because I'm going to try and win it in a second. Second of all, because, you know, they need to like be able to develop these pieces. Well, the best way to defend it would actually be to move their king off the diagonal so this bishop was defending it and it could play to e5. All right, so if we want to move the king, then we're looking at like rook e8, rook f6. Rook f6 looks very exposed as far as like the rook getting itself killed. It gives white ideas of g4, g5. It gives white ideas of bishop d4. Yeah, bishop d4 could be winning against that. Okay, or I could play bishop f6, king g7. But again, you know, whichever piece I put on f6 for black is going to be really, really risky until black is able to play e5 themselves. So it's got to kind of all come with tempo. If we try and defend the pawn from here, white has just rook h1 with a kind of killing position. I'll show you this because this is cool. Well, first of all, e5 wins a piece, but I just wanted to show you this. Once we've opened our bishop, this is a checkmate again. And if the king comes to g7, then I can achieve my plan of f5. I'm just wondering if it's even stronger to play rook h1 here before playing f5. But I think not, because I think the risk with rook h1 is if you give black even one move to get this bishop out from c8, suddenly their rooks defend each other. The bishop can get somewhere active and defend this pawn from there. You know, you have to have like a really immediate win with rook h1 if you're going to allow this bishop out. So I'm just going to play f5, which was my main idea anyway. And, well, this g-pawn's hanging, and it has no real value for black, so I might as well try trading it. Now I'm thinking about, like, rook to g8. King to e8. I guess I need to trade something. I mean, white's going to play rook e4 and win. Or, next move, rook h1 and win. So if we try rook to g8, check, here, check. This is decisive. King comes wherever it wants to, but now white wins the e-pawn and has this rook here. I'm looking if there's any way to like win like another pawn, make this even more decisive, but I don't really see it. I'm just going to play here, here, takes, bishop f4, you know, c5, bishop here. And then I'll win a second pawn on the queen side. I guess I give my g pawn, but the queen side looks like a great place to be collecting pawns. And the other option would be c6, bishop here, so as not to lose the pawns. But then they all get stuck on light squares around this guy, here, here. And I assume that white can win this kind of thing. So this plan looks extremely strong to me of just f4, f5. You know, we could try rook to e8 instead of bishop f6. But again, rook here hits this. You kind of have to defend it, and white again comes with f5. Now, I just don't see what black's defense would be based on here. I just don't see it at all. King here, there's rook g6 check, and if you take on f5, you lose the piece, so it forces you back here, and then, oh, I don't know, white could take on e6 with the bishop and then with the rook. Or white could play rook h1, going for rook h7, waiting to take this. If rook h8, then rook g7, king g7, bishop d4 ends the game. So this plan looks pretty unstoppable of f4, f5. So actually, in this particular game, it looks to me like the d file would have been of more value to Wesley than the h file. Simply because black's defensive plan revolves around trying to trade pieces on e6, and the threat of playing rook d7 is extremely strong if pieces are traded. The interesting thing is if no pieces get traded, the easier place for white to break through would probably be the h file, where they can amass more forces. On the other hand, if black goes for some trades, the place where you can really exploit black right after the trades is this open file with more attacks against pawns, right? Because attacking his king, it's hard to like, his king is not like a weakness. It's a pretty strong defensive piece, right? So if you're trying to attack like right where the opponent's king is after a simplification, you're actually attacking into an extra defensive piece. The king actually wants to go in the endgame to wherever you're trying to penetrate and stop you from penetrating. So if black gets some piece trades, you do not want to attack him on the H file in response to that. You want to try and get to D7. That's the weakness. So this rook D1 move is so strong, it prevents black from making exactly the trades they want to. It forces them passive. And that's really the best way to win here. If instead of going for knight e6, black, stayed passive in a position like this with like, I don't know, like, let's say like rook d8, and then the idea of like bishop to c8. Problem is here, again, rook d1 is like the good move, right, guys? Because on bishop c8, you've got f7. So actually this d file is super valuable, and you can actually keep black from contesting it. So if black wants to go like super ultra passive, play like rook e8 defending this pawn with the idea then bishop c8, in this position with black being super passive, maybe your breakthrough will be more easily on the king side than on the d file, because black might have enough pieces to control the entry points, right? But you've got so many active pieces that you might want to checkmate his king, right? You might go for a pawn storm, f4, g4, f5, or f4, e5, just to restrain this piece. But very plausibly, at some point, you play rook h1 to help you break through. Maybe with bishop d4 or something like that. But it seems like as long as there's a bunch of pieces on the board, no, as long as black has the possibility to quickly make a couple trades, you want to make sure actually that you're poised to get to the d file, not that you're overcommitted to the h file. And if your opponent goes super passive and lets you keep all your pieces, and you slowly, you're controlling the key squares, and his pieces aren't even in position to trade you off anymore, then maybe you switch over to this h file attack, which we saw that you can use the h file. There are plenty of scenarios where the h file is extremely useful, and you really can like smash black with an h file attack. But you need to be aware that in the face of simplifications, the d file is going to be more valuable because their king isn't there to defend the penetration points. Okay. I feel like we have reached like a super deep understanding of the question that we were asking ourselves. I'm like super satisfied with this lesson. You guys pumped? Did you learn something? How good was that? And I don't say that every time, you know that. Not trying to be weird here, but that was cool. I'd already thought about this a little bit, but I hadn't fully figured out the details, and the details have matched what I had theorized. So I'm pretty happy to have now sort of proven to myself what I was kind of imagining. That